and welcome to yet another session of In Dialogue Foundation Certificate Course in Dialogue Studies 2024-2025. Today we have the pleasure of having with us Dr. Maya Joshi, who would be speaking on Otherness, Place and Belonging, an exploration by literature of the Partition. Dr. Maya Joshi has been teaching literature at the Department of English, Lady Shri Ram College, for almost 30 years. She works across languages and has research interests in issues of culture, identity, and history, besides Buddhist philosophy and heritage. She has been a Fulbright postdoctoral scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, working towards an intellectual biography of polymath Rahul Sankrityayan. She has published widely on these issues and has been invited to speak at universities in India and abroad, besides dialogues across disciplines outside the academy. We welcome you, Dr. Maya Joshi. You have up to 2 hours for the session. You may leave as much time for questions and discussions as you like. And as usual, I would like to remind the participants to keep their cameras on during the session. Ma'am, the floor is all yours.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Pragya. Thanks, Behzad. There is a background to this, my being here, that I think I should explain. We met at Fireflies Dialogues later, actually, at the end of last year, Behzad and I. And we were participating in a conversation around the question of, peace building, communal harmony, and addressing issues of ecology, in the context of which I decided to speak on partition literature. I have been teaching for about 30 years, and partition literature as a course, as a paper, has been part of the syllabus for only about 10 years. This is not going to be a conversation about, the detailed history or the political causes, and it's not going to be analytical vis-a-vis the partition as a phenomenon. What I'm going to be focusing on is the literary response. So the question that often comes up is, why literature? Why should we be looking at fiction? And by literature, I mean novels, short stories, poems, memoirs, and sometimes letters, and personal autobiographical accounts. What is the use of reading material of this kind for our understanding of a phenomenon such as the partition? Now, I do understand that we have a very diverse audience. I was looking very carefully at the profiles, and I realized that the age group is from 18 to 64. And from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, and as far as Kazakhstan. So I cannot take anything for granted. Most Indians, of course, are aware. And, if you're from North India or Bengal, especially Punjab and Bengal, partition is a very real memory. It has impacted lives. It displaced people. Lives were lost. And the trauma and the consequences of it are still being experienced. However, even if you've not had a personal experience of the partition, if your family does not have a history of it, it's, I think, still something that you need to take into account as a citizen of this country and as a citizen of the world at large. Because the themes that come up when you study the partition, the concerns that come up, are profoundly human. So simply being human requires you to engage with this thing called the partition. So I will try to look at how literature, bears witness to this enormous tragedy, this cataclysmic tragedy that was the partition, and how writers responded to it with empathy, with shock, with horror, and also with a kind of protest against the logic of it. So we have diverse responses across the board. I will be focusing not just on the Punjab side of the story, but also on the Bengal side of the story, which has tended to be neglected. That's been something we try to redress at Delhi University. We read quite a bit of literature and memoirs from Bengal. Very often when you talk about, the partition, the focus primarily has been on, North India and Punjab. So that's some background to what I'm going to be dealing with. Just some basic facts. When you look at Bengal, when you say the partition of Bengal, 1947 is not the first time that Bengal is partitioned. 1905 is the first partition. And in 1911, East and West Bengal are reunited. But 1947, when we gained independence and Punjab was partitioned, Bengal was also partitioned all over again. Okay? I don't need to go into the history of the partition except to remind us that someone came who did not know the land and drew lines, right? And that's part of the problem. However, what you have in literature is profound protest against this artificial division of lines. So if you look at the earliest responses, there is someone like Rabindranath Tagore himself, who is, celebrating glorious Bengal, Shonar Bangla, right? My beloved Bengal, he says, I love you. And it is a celebration of the skies and of the mango groves in the spring and paddy fields in autumn and the banyan trees and the banks of the rivers. Bengal is the mother. And it's with tear-filled eyes that he, laments this partition of this land. Another Bengali poet, Jibanananda Das, says the same thing. He says, go where you will. I'm translating, of course. These are English translations. Go where you will. I shall remain on Bengal's shore. He refused to move. And he's talking about jackfruit leaves and forest oaks and white conch bangled hands and, grieving women. I have seen Bengal's face, he says. That is why I do not seek beauty of the earth anymore. So there is a profound attachment to the land, profound, love for the land, and a certain and Bengal imagined as a bucolic, idyllic space, a pastoral, rich, green, fertile land with a very sweet language and with beautiful flora and fauna and so on. A more modern Bengali writer like Taslima Nasreen continues that. Broken Bengal is one of her poems. You've probably heard of Taslima Nasreen, and I'm reading some bits of it. There was a land watered and fruitful. People of that land used to swing on festive days, just as the golden paddy swung in the breeze. So again, images of festivity, of paddy fields, rice fields, happy fairs, autumn clouds, the smell of the soil, the lush, the rain which soaks you, the dream of the people, the roots of the land are shaken, she says. And it's like releasing a wild bull in a flower garden. Partition was like that. And she ends on the note of, barbed wire as the kind of violence that is committed against it. Another of her poems is, on the same theme. It's called Denial. I want to erase the word 47. 47 being 1947, the year of the partition. I want to wash away the ink stain of 47 with water and soap. 47, the word pricks like a thorn in my throat. I do not want to swallow it. I want to vomit it out, right? And she talks about how she's not only thinking of Bengal's land, but also Bihar's forests of, Sal forests and Ajanta and Ellora, a larger cultural heritage, a civilizational heritage, which you have been separated from by virtue of the partition. And this idea of civilizational continuity and breaks and losses will be there in a lot of partition literature. If you look at, these similar ideas you'll find in Faiz Ahmad Faiz, one of his most famous poems, Subah Hai Azadi, which, talks about the morning of, freedom. And it's a very dystopic version of freedom because he says this is not the freedom that we had wished for, right? Ye wo seher to nahi, right? And it has led, the translation of that, ye daag daag ujala, ye shab gazida seher, right? This night-bitten dawn, right? So with freedom, the dawn of freedom, which was supposed to be a celebration, has also come this profound pain. You have Amrita Pritam, Aaj Aakhain Varishano, Punjabi poem, very well-known writer Amrita Pritam, who witnessed the partition, and she writes this poem translated as I Call Upon Varish Shah, which is again a lament. It's a very powerful, emotional lament about the consequences of the partition. And what is she lamenting? She's lamenting in idealized Punjab, right? Punjab, of course, the land of the five rivers, the breadbasket, this fertile land with robust people, peasants, who were prosperous and who fed everybody, and the women particularly who suffer the most in times of crisis. So she's remembering Varish Shah because Varish Shah wrote this classic epic called Heer Ranjha. And Heer as a genre is a part of the composite culture of Punjab. Varish Shah is equally revered and loved by the Sikhs, the Hindus, and the Muslims of Punjab. So he becomes a representative of this shared heritage, which Punjab represents, the best of Punjab represents, and which is destroyed and ripped asunder and by the partition, which is seen as something imposed from outside. It's almost as if, it was an idyllic land and somebody came and poisoned the waters. She uses those metaphors of poisoning and snakes and, the flute of the lover. Ranjha is always seen with a flute, right? That has turned into, that bamboo groves have turned into snakes, So there's very elaborate imagery of poisoning of a very fertile and life-giving land. And the women's charkhas have broken, So again, these images of women in a idealized rural Punjab who are swinging, the jhula and singing and a sense of community. All of that is violently destroyed. So why is it so important to invoke Varish Shah? Because, as I said, he represents this composite culture, and because he is lamenting. Heer is an elaborate lamentation of the tragedy of Heer Ranjha, right? Heer is his heroine, and she is prevented from being with her beloved Ranjha by the machinations of, society, which comes as a villain between them. So, star-crossed lovers, therefore, become symbols for the destruction of love and this replacement of love with hate in the land of Punjab, right? So the suffering of the bereft women, because what happens in violence, in any kind of conflict, in any war, it's women who are the greater sufferers because they suffer at multiple levels. They suffer sexual violence. They are the repositories of the community's honor. So revenge is taken through the bodies of the women. Honor killings also took place during the partition, as Urvashi Butalia has pointed out. And women become, and of course, men are killed, so women become, widows, and sometimes abducted women were forcibly repatriated. So there's a whole elaborate network of, consequences that women in particular have to bear of the partition, which goes beyond the simple, quote unquote, simple killing of people of the other community. So what happens in Amrita Pritam is that the leadership is seen to have abandoned the boat. She uses the metaphor of the boatman having abandoned the boat. And so there is this idea that, these leaders sitting outside, far away, remote people we don't know have sort of not done what was needed to protect life and property and, have not ensured what needs to be done. This will come up again in Fikr Toswi's Chhata Darya, which is a memoir. Have you heard of Fikr Toswi? Can I have some show of hands? It's a very powerful memoir written during the partition in Urdu. Fikr Toswi was a Hindu, actually. His name was Ramlal Bhatia. Fikr Toswi was his pen name. It was the name he took on as a writer. And he writes a very powerful memoir, which records the actual moment, like it starts before 15th of August and it continues. He was in Lahore and he refused to leave Lahore. As a Hindu, he was required to leave Lahore and come to this side, and he refuses, and it's a resistance against this enforced displacement from a city which was represented culture and civilization. Lahore was a center for the arts. It was considered the Paris of the East, right? And there is a whole community of writers and poets who, which include Sahir Ludhianvi and people like that, who were his friends. So for him, religion obviously is not the most important marker of identity. And he also blames, the leadership. There is this whole sense that these people out there, far away, sitting in Delhi and so on, have kind of betrayed us and have thrown us into this hell. And the city is burning. But there are also extraordinary acts of kindness, help, and compassion that come through in many of these writings. But primarily there is a sense of alienation, right, and of bewilderment, like what is happening, confusion. I do feel that there is a tendency to romanticize, perhaps, what the situation of Punjab was at the time or prior to it. Tensions, did exist, but there was, of course, a very powerful shared culture of, between amongst the communities of shared language, food, and poetry. I mean, just think about it. We often tend to communalize and divide languages along religious lines, right? So here's Fikr Toswi, Ramlal Bhatia, as Hindu as a name can be, writing in Urdu, right? And of course, we know that Bangladesh was formed on the question of the love for Bangla that the Muslims of East Pakistan had, right? So language and community and religion do not overlap. So I think that's one learning, and I find many of my students realize this with a bit of a shock, because there are these stereotypes that we have about these issues. So to come back to Waris Shah, the poet, who is like the bard of Punjab, he is invoked again in another powerful story by an iconic writer that you've probably heard of, called Saadat Hasan Manto. Does that ring a bell? Can I sort of see some? Yeah. Manto has been immortalized more recently in cinema. There's a film made on him by Nandita Das, but very powerful writer, very powerful recorder of suffering, and in his own unique way, he shakes up the conscience of his readers. So the story that I'm referring to is called in Urdu Tetwal Ka Kutta. It's been translated as the dog of Tetwal. And Tetwal is a place in, along the borders of India and Pakistan. It takes place after the partition has happened. The armies are stationed on both sides. And it's in that context that he invokes Waris Shah, Heer. What he shows you is that, there are these bored young men on both sides. These are soldiers, Sikh. There's a Sikh Paltan on this side, and where the names are very indicative of religious identity. And there are Muslims on the other side. But they are identical in their emotions, right? So they're sort of sitting around defending this piece of rock, this rocky land, and they are getting, they're remembering their beloveds. So they're singing here. So the dominant mood is not of violence or anger against the enemy, but of, feeling, what is called in Sanskrit poetics, viraha. The rasa is viraha, right? Of separation from the beloved. And it's in that, it's a very romantic, soft image of the soldier that you get, the young soldier. And they're also, of course, cooking on both sides, and the smoke is mingling up in the skies, smoke from both sides. And that again becomes a very powerful metaphor or an image for, the shared life, essentially, right? Eros rather than thanatos, to use, kind of Freudian language. What happens so there's a mirrored reality. right? And things just get out of hand. There is a poor dog who seems to go from one place to the other, and he becomes a hapless victim of a very random kind of act of violence. And the poor dog dies, and he is a symbol of the mindless violence that can result from sloganeering and from just empty evocations of, because there is no real threat to anybody. The dog gets labeled by human beings. So this is the first instance, and I'm going to come to another instance later, of a man, of a human and non-human connection or confrontation, where the non-human shows up the humanity or the inhumanity of the humans, right? The theme of dehumanization is a very powerful theme that runs through the partition, because the question that was most often asked was, what happened to our humanity? How could people kill their best friends, neighbors, and so on? How could this violence happen on this scale? And it raises very interesting questions about nature. Nature as a witness, nature as something which does not recognize boundaries. Boundaries are man-made. So for the dog, there are no, the dog has no nationality. Right? Dogs don't understand the nation state. They don't understand religion, right? Which leads me to another wonderful story coming from Bangladesh this time, written in Bangla. It's called Tale of a Tulsi Plant. It's by a man called Sayyid Waliullah. Okay. Tale of a Tulsi Plant. Now, all of you know what Tulsi represents? What is the meaning of... Are we having a conversation, Pragya, at all? Does that format ever happen here?
Yes, you can have a conversation in the middle as well, and or at the end. So we can have that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from people what if I say Tulsi plant, what are the connotations? What images come to your mind?
Sacredness.
Yes, absolutely. Sacredness. It is worshipped. And?
Purity.
Purity, yes.
And it is something which is outside the house. It might be very sacred, but it is never allowed inside.
Yes, it is a plant which needs to, well, it also needs light and air. So that may be one reason. But it's also not planted just randomly anywhere. Very often it's planted on an elevated platform and worshipped, right, ritualistically. What else does Tulsi do or represent? We are still in the middle of winter in North India. Nobody drinks Tulsi tea here?
Medicinal.
It is known as a medicinal plant, which perhaps is a reason why it is worshipped. There's a connection between the beneficial qualities of various things and their, eventual elevation to the level of something sacred. So Tulsi is a very powerful herb, which is supposed to be, antipyretic, anti-inflammatory. It, heals coughs and colds and so on. It's an essential part of all home remedies, as, I think most people are aware. But it is also associated with a religion, interestingly enough, right? Who worships, in the context of the partition, who would worship a Tulsi plant, right? What community would be associated with? And that does become part of the deliberations in this story. So what happens is, the story is taking place in what is now Bangladesh, okay? Partition has happened. There are refugees from West Bengal who have gone to that side. They are Muslims, and they're poor Muslims, and they are looking for shelter. So one of the things that happened with refugees was that the state apparatus pretty much abandoned them, right? They were, so there was the violence of the partition, and then there was bureaucratic neglect, which caused a lot more suffering. So you have these people who are, so there's a bunch of men actually who've all been working in factories, and they're poor kind of working class kind of people largely, who find an abandoned mansion, a big house, and they just take over. Houses were abandoned during the partition. People ran away and saved their lives, and these guys just take over, and they decide that this is going to be their home. They're, of course, very surprised to see such a big, beautiful home. They've never seen a house like this. So an element of class analysis also enters into this. And they find a wilting tulsi plant in that house. Okay. Now that tulsi plant evokes very diverse responses from these men. And I want us to reflect a little bit on that. One of these men has a persistent cough. Okay. I told you they worked in, they were poor men, they worked in bad working conditions. So, they have bad health. One of the things they're celebrating is the bright light and fresh air that they're getting in this house. So he has a racking cough and he notices the plant and he says, oh, this is medicinal, right? Another man who is a fundamentalist of sorts says, oh, that's a Hindu plant. We must kill it, right? And he says, we're going to beat it. He wants to beat the plant to death with sticks, right? This fellow who has a cold, who has a cough, is also of a poetic temperament. He's not only thinking of the plant as a beautiful, as a herb, as a healing herb. He is also led to imagine the life of the lady of the house who must have watered the plant, because the tulsi plant is also associated with women, right? Women take care of it, right? Women worship tulsi and women water it. And this is a dying plant. So he is, suddenly, there's a tender rumination about, how sad that woman must have been who had to leave her tulsi behind and what it must mean for her to leave her home behind. And it is a profound moment of humanization, right? Instead of hate, he's feeling a connection because their displacement is not the only displacement. The house they've taken over is the house of somebody who's also had to be displaced and who's now a refugee in West Bengal. So the tulsi plant becomes an occasion, a symbol, a space for a human drama to unfold, which shows you human categories of analysis. After all, worshipping and, eulogizing something is giving it cultural meaning. The plant by itself is simply botanical life, right? The plant doesn't have a religion, right? We have given it that identity. And that itself makes it an object of hate for the man who is full of anger because of what has happened, right? And he's taking it out on that innocent plant. And it shows you the absurdity, much like Manto's Toba Singh, the dog of Tetwal does, of human beings taking out their frustrations, their anger on a hapless, non-human life form. At the same time, the plant is scientifically, botanically, a healing plant. And it is not going to distinguish between Muslim lungs and chest and Hindu lungs and chest. So this man who has a cough has been secretly watering the plant because they notice that it's suddenly becoming green. And simultaneously, his cough has got better, right? So it's a very subtle metaphor, very simple way of showing you how nature doesn't recognize these boundaries, right? The plant is not going to say, I'm not going to heal a Muslim, right? Cold. And it becomes a very powerful and poignant symbol of that, the absence and presence of the refugee, of the person displaced. And it sort of, works as a conscience keeper almost, right? This non-human life form in men who are otherwise quite hardened and quite dehumanized by their experiences. Okay, there is also an element of class here because they are resentful of people who have these big houses and we never had this kind of a life. There's also a kind of Hobbesian selfishness because they are not letting other refugees come into the house. People who are their co-religionists who are also refugees like them are kept out because these people become selfish and say, "Nay, we are going to we don't have any space," right? So it shows you it's a study in human nature and how crises can bring out some of the worst tendencies of human beings. But in the midst of all of this very hardened humanity, you have, this tender plant and this image of this woman, a very gentle image of this woman, who must have been crying as she had to leave her beloved plant behind. So how do you keep humanity intact in these, horribly dehumanized times? That's one of the themes that this story shows up. The other interesting theme that it shows up is that you have a lot of internal diversity. You don't have one kind of person. Even amongst those 5 refugees who come from the same class and the same religion, they have different attitudes. One is a leftist, right? He doesn't want to talk about religion at all initially, right? Religion doesn't matter to him and he doesn't want hate. The fundamentalist is making everybody get angry. And then there is this gentle fellow who's, doesn't want to get into this hate politics. So what you have is a kind of very complex view of a community. So you cannot reduce a community to a monolith. That's what the story seems to be saying, right? You have many voices within any community. And sometimes they will clash with each other. And that's a profoundly humanizing activity that literature can perform, which is to show you the complexities, the nuances, the multiplicities, the multiple voices within any given situation, right? Which stereotypes and propaganda tries to deny, right? Propaganda on the basis of communal and identity and so on always homogenizes the other, right? The other has to be one single type, right? So that you can hate it. Whereas what literature often shows you is how internally fractured and internally layered and complex that other might be, right? And that itself, I think, brings in an element of profound humanity. So even this, homogenized Muslim refugee, community of men of the same gender, obviously, and the same class background, are also thinking differently. Forget about other voices outside. So that's one of the gifts of this story for us. It's a meditation on identity and belonging. We see, these freshly arrived refugees seeking shelter. It's, the theme of shelter and of of displacement, which is a very powerful theme during the partition, is what, the story highlights. Okay. The humanizing presence of the plant, which makes man, now what happened is during the partition, the violence against women was such that if you read a story, for instance, like Peshawar Express by Krishan Chandra, it's a very powerful and very brutal story. It is a story that, when I teach it, my students often say, there should be a trigger warning, because it's so violent. It is about a train, Peshawar Express. He puts the words in the mouth of the train, Krishan Chandra. And the train is carrying refugees from Pakistan to India and returning with people here. And essentially what happens is that the train is stopped at various junctures and bloodbaths take place. And bodies are being carried on the train. And of course, women are being molested and, enormous. So at the end of it, you have a traumatized train. Okay. And the train actually says that if I, a metal object, can feel so much, if I can be so traumatized, imagine what it's like for human beings. So what Krishan Chandra is doing through that is to show you the extent of dehumanization, right? The question that is being asked is, what does it mean to be human? If human beings can do this to each other and a train can be traumatized by human behavior, what is left of humanity? Okay. A parallel question that he's asking is, what is left of civilization? Because one of the worst massacres happens at a station called Takshila. Does Takshila ring any bells? What does Takshila stand for or mean to you?
The ancient university.
And where is it located? We still have the ruins in Pakistan.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was a Buddhist university, and it is associated with the Buddha, who's, associated with peace. It was also an international university. Like Nalanda and Vikramshila, these were universities that attracted people from all over the world. They were so high class and they were so open. So you have this great heritage, of the past, where you were hosting people from different communities, colors, races, in the pursuit of knowledge, right? So you have the high point of civilization, as it were, right? What humans are capable of, which is to pursue knowledge and to be capable of befriending strangers, right? To be able to transcend the differences of color and race and so on, right? And of course, not just knowledge, but arts, painting, right? All sorts of things which we associate with human evolution, right? Human evolving beyond brutal, survival needs to the cultivation of the more refined things in life. So when this happens at Takshila, there is a rather obvious way in which Krishan Chandra kind of asserts this point about what is happening right now. So instead of progressing or even maintaining, we have regressed, right? So this theme of regression into a kind of brutal, existence, brutalization of an extreme kind. And, there's a relentlessness about the way he goes about it, right? So, this is the land of the Buddha, this is the land of, peace, and this is the land of civilization, etc., etc. So, the point I was trying to make is that the train becomes a witness to, and a traumatized witness to this human, loss of whatever humanity had achieved in the past. So this is a refrain that you will have in partition literature quite a bit, about our great shared past, civilizational achievements, and how overnight, as it were, all of that seems to have gone. Similarly, the plant and the dog of Tetwal, these are all examples, I would say, of non-human life forms, or not even life forms. The train is not a living entity, becoming mirrors, right? Very powerful mirrors, holding up a mirror to what human beings are capable of doing. So the question of humanity and of displacement is taken up very powerfully by another writer whom I've already mentioned, Manto, in a story which is perhaps the most iconic story about the partition, Toba Tek Singh. Is this familiar? Toba Tek Singh? No? So I see some people who have heard of it. Okay, so I will have to talk a little bit about it. Now, Manto places the story in a mental asylum. Okay? Now, Manto is known for drawing attention to social, spaces which are neglected by mainstream society. Okay? That is the job of the writer as he sees it, right? To hold up a mirror and to reflect that reality which comfortable middle class people who read literature don't want to think about, right? So mental health is one of those issues. People hide, right? There's shame associated with it and nobody's thinking about it. So in other stories, he'll talk about, neglected sections of society, people who are considered marginalized. It's in that strain that you have to see the location of this story. But there is much more that he's doing with the idea of the insane asylum, of madness. Okay. So Toba Tek Singh is the name of a place. It is the name of a village. The main character in the story is also called Toba Tek Singh. His actual name is Bishan Singh. He's a Sikh. He's a landowner who comes from the village called Toba Tek Singh, but he's so attached to his land that despite his, losing his mental faculties, You're not exactly told what happened to him. You're just told that one day he just flipped and his family brought him in chains. They shackled him and put him in this asylum. Okay? And he doesn't talk. He's incapable of, regular communication. He speaks a kind of nonsense sentence, which I will, read out, a little bit later. Opad di gurgur di moong dal di lalten, that sort of, there's a very famous sentence which is a disjointed sentence. And it is supposed to indicate his disconnect from so-called normalcy. Apparently, he's a catatonic schizophrenic. However, despite his disconnect, right, from reality, he is, whenever somebody comes to visit him, mulakat is the word that's used, right? Mulakat are the people who are allowed to visit inmates from his village. He immediately, so he's a man who doesn't, dress up. He doesn't comb his hair. He's a Sikh, so he has long hair. He's neglected himself completely. He's not even sat down. He's stood up all these years. His legs are swollen. But whenever somebody from his village comes, he gets dressed, he combs his hair, he prepares himself, because it indicates his absolute attachment to only one thing, which is his village. So he has come to be identified with the village, and he's called Toba Teksi. Okay, so this is a very powerful, as you can see, way of thinking about the partition, because the partition compelled people to leave their villages, their homes, and relocate themselves against their will. Okay, and so this is highlighting the attachment that you have for your land. We saw that earlier with Tagore and so on, right? The attachment to, a particular kind of landscape, a particular kind of land. And this is a farmer, and from Punjab. So you can imagine what the land might mean to him. It is his whole identity, right? It would be the land of his ancestors. Now, Toba Tek Singh is also associated with this village is also associated with a kind of Sufi tradition. So that adds another layer. Because as we know, the Sufi tradition cuts across religious divides, right? Sufis were worshipped, continue to be worshipped by people from different religious communities. They're open to everybody. The very essence of Sufism is love, universal love, which does not recognize any boundaries. So that's also something we have to keep in mind. So what happens in Toba Tek Singh is that you have this asylum where there are multiple, again, very diverse voices. There are some people who are for Hindustan and Pakistan, but some who are protesting, and some like Toba Tek Singh who are just obsessed with finding out where Toba Tek Singh will be. Will it be in Pakistan or in Hindustan? He's not interested in either Hindustan or Pakistan. He's only interested in Toba Tek Singh. That's his identity, right? So it's, in a way, it shows you that the primary, way in which you attach yourself to a space is not necessarily this abstraction called the nation state, but a very specific location, which could be your village or your town or your city, like Lahore was for Fikr Tauswi. Incidentally, partition has happened and people have been divided. Several years later, they think about the mad people, right? Somebody figures out, okay, there is this insane asylum and we have people, we have to divide those people also, right? So that's where the conversation is. And it's quite, there's a dark comedy about the way the whole story progresses. But to cut a long story short, Toba Tek Singh, when he, they're compelled to move, refuses to move, and he collapses at the border, at the no man's land. And that is his protest, a very powerful physical protest with the only language he can protest against this, forced displacement. It's his refusal of the entire project of the partition, as it were. And of course, what Manto is doing through this is to show you the madness outside, right? That's a very obvious use of the metaphor of madness, right? Because what we are told is that this man, Bishan Singh, is a harmless man. He's never hurt anybody, right? And then you have all that violence outside, right? So Manto is compelling you to think about who is sane and who is insane, right? The people who are locked up inside, or the so-called sane people outside who are rationally taking these decisions and arbitrarily dividing people randomly and going around killing each other. Right? So it becomes a very powerful way of reflecting on the theme of the madness of the partition, which is an idea which keeps getting repeated in many works of literature. Okay, that there was a kind of madness that came over people. You could not explain it rationally, why people were behaving the way they were behaving. There is the tale of a Tulsi plant. Here too, you have different kinds of voices within the asylum also. There is no one kind of person. And I think that's again a very interesting, it's like a microcosm of the world outside, while also being a critique of the world outside. All right. There is a poem that Gulzar, who you all have heard of, he's a contemporary poet. He continues to write for the Hindi film industry. He wrote a poem called Toba Tek Singh several decades after the original story was written. And I want to just read out a little bit of it for you to experience it. Right? He says, I have to go and meet Toba Tek Singh's Bishan at Vaga. Right? Vaga is the border. I am told he still stands on his swollen feet where Manto had left him. He still mutters, Uppar di gurgur di moong di dal di lalten. I have to locate that mad fellow who used to speak up from a branch high above. So in the story, there is one guy who climbs a tree. Okay, and he says, I'm not coming down. मैं तो इस पेड़ पे ही रहूंगा. मुझे ना हिंदुस्तान जाना है ना पाकिस्तान जाना है. Right? So and there was another guy who says, I'm God. Okay, so Gulzar is saying, I have to locate that mad fellow who used to speak from a branch high above. He's God. He alone has to decide whose village to whose side. When will he move down that branch? He is to be told there are some more left still who are being divided, made into pieces. There are some more partitions to be done. That partition was only the first one. Okay? This is just a small part of the story. So it just shows you the continued relevance of and the resonance of the theme, which makes a contemporary poet, write about it as if it is a contemporary reality, not something in the past. Can we forget the partition and put it away in a box as if it is over, or is it still continuing with us? That is the question that Gulzar is asking us to reflect on. And there are many writers who continue to write about it. Anirudh Kala has a collection of stories about the partition. He's a practicing psychiatrist, in which he traces, in one story, he traces, 2 generations, of partition affected people. And it's a story of reconciliation, across the border. So the theme continues to resonate with writers even today. So the theme of madness and derangement is a very common one, as you would expect. Another story that explores this is by Joginder Paul. And in the original, it's called Khwab Raw. And it's been translated as sleepwalkers. Okay, sleepwalkers are people who walk in their sleep, right? To cut a very long story short, it is about a Maulvi Sahaba, an aristocrat from Lucknow. You all know Lucknow, another city with a lot of, like Lahore, a lot of history and a lot of culture and a lot of, resonances. So he has to relocate after the partition. They are relocated to Karachi. And he cannot accept Karachi as his home. He carries Lucknow in him. Okay. And he goes around, he walks the cities at night, the city at night in the dark. And he's gone quite mad. He's called Diwane Maulvi Sahab. Diwana means mad, right? Telling everybody that he's carrying Lucknow inside him. And he would open his mouth and say, see, you can see Lucknow inside me, right? So it's a very rather, obvious way of thinking about how places cannot be replaced so easily. in the consciousness, right? Like Toba Tek-Singh, place is a very powerful marker of identity. And the violence of the partition isn't just the killing that happened, which happened, of course, brutal killings, but the violence is also the violence of displacement, of having to leave your home, of becoming a refugee, and of feeling completely unhomed, of feeling like a stranger in a new land, right? Even if you had enough to eat, which not all refugees had, even if you were well taken care of, even if you had your compensation given to you, it could be a profoundly traumatizing experience. Now, there is a small element of privilege also, just to come back to a kind of intersectional engagement with this question of, the refugee. We've seen very poor refugees in the story called Tale of a Tulsi Plant. They've never seen a house like that. Someone like Diwani Maulvi Sahab is missing, his aristocratic Lucknow. And a lot of this nostalgia, and of course, Bishan Singh is a big landowner, right? So for him, Toba Tek-Singh is also about, that ownership of land. What if you were a very poor person who never had anything, right? What kind of nostalgia would you have for the place that you had to leave behind, right? That adds another dimension to this question of displacement. And a certain kind of, and there's an element of privilege in this nostalgia for a lost home, because, it assumes that you had a home, right? So when you talk to people who are displaced, partition refugees, they will often talk about, "Arey, hamara itna bada ghar tha, we had this big haveli, or we had this land, and we lost all of that." But there were also poor people, right, who didn't have anything. There is a story by Manik Bandyopadhyay, Bangla story, as the name might suggest, which has been translated as The Final Solution. The original Bangla is Upay. Upay means a way out, right? Just a solution. But it has been translated by Professor Rani Ray, the late Professor Rani Ray, as The Final Solution. And this takes you into Calcutta's railway station, where a family of refugees has just arrived and they're just managing to sleep there. And there is a young woman who has a baby she has to feed, a husband who's very ill, and a sister-in-law who's also quite helpless. And they are utterly vulnerable. And one man who pretends to be a social worker, who is actually a pimp, he's actually in the trade of, getting these women, particularly targeting very, very needy women, and getting them to work for his prostitution ring, in the guise of being a social worker, right? So these are the kinds of vulnerabilities that people could have, right? And this is someone from his own, this is Mallika is a heroine, and this guy's name, he's also Hindu. This is a fellow Indian Hindu who is going to be like a vulture, taking advantage of this woman. So it adds another layer to this question of, how the violence happened. Was the violence always from the other side, or, there were people who were like, exploiting the vulnerable from their own communities. So Mallika is, she agrees to do what he asks because she wants to feed the baby. Her primary thrust is feeding the baby. It's literally about having enough to eat. And there is no nostalgia in that story. There is no reference to where they came from, right? Not any element of, we had a home, or because the luxury of nostalgia is not allowed to these people. They're so desperate. Okay, so I think that element also needs to be brought in. At the end of the story, I don't want to spoil it for you, but she does do something very drastic, and she actually kills this man, and it is seen as a redemptive act of violence, and she takes, because the police is not helping, nobody's helping, so she just takes things into her own hands, and she defends her honor in a sense by killing this horrible man who is, hiding his ill intentions behind the guise of goodness.
So, very Durga-like. She
very
does it.
Durga-like. Yeah, very Durga-like. This is coming out of Bengal, so you cannot help but think about Kali and Durga, the angry goddess who just decides to, destroy this demon. So you have vulnerability, you have the utter precarity of their existence, but you also have strength and power and resistance, right? The police, the bureaucratic system, everything is broken down in the story. Nobody's helping. So you are left to your own devices, right? But what I found interesting is that there is not even a trace of any kind of nostalgia or, this theme of missing a home or, like you have in Khwabro, my Lucknow, etc. So even that also comes from privilege, right? Which brings me to another, neglected area in partition studies, which we don't know enough about, which is the Dalit voices. This is something that Urvashi Butalia, who has studied the partition, especially women, has written and talked about. Okay, that she says, I didn't even think about it, and it shows my own kind of blindness to the question of caste. Because when she encountered this particular woman who was working as a cleaner, who said, hame to koi nahi puchta hai. We are, nobody cares for us. We don't care for, in fact, there was a demand for Achutistan, which I learned while teaching the partition. There was actually a demand for Achutistan, for a land of the untouchables. Because they said we don't belong to either, because caste system cuts across religious lines in India. All communities, all religions, regardless of whether their religions permit it or not, practice it in reality, right? So this is one of the blind spots, and there is work that needs to be done on finding out, those the history of those people. We don't have histories. In fact, records have still not been made public. So literature is very helpful because it helps us reconstruct lives. It gives us insights from multiple perspectives on what might have happened to different kinds of people during the partition. Right? There is the question of women takes on very interesting turns, because women are, double marginalized, right? Patriarchy and then communal violence. So women were, of course, there were mass rapes. Rape was used as a political weapon, because to dishonor the women of the other community was a way of taking revenge against that community. And then you kill them, right? So there was an added layer. Women were also abducted forcibly, and they sometimes started living and had families with these men, and sometimes then they were repatriated. There was this whole movement for recovering abducted women, which again feminist critics have written about. Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, and Kamla Bhasin have all written on the question of recovering women's voices and the complexity of that task. So these abducted women were, what would happen is that they would be abducted, and then they started new families. Now you're a mother of 3 children with some man who has abducted you, and you're settled more or less, and then your home's country is saying, nay, we have to take you back. Right? So these women were in a very difficult situation, and sometimes they didn't want to go back, because it would, what would be their life once they returned? What kind of, given the nature of patriarchal society, what would be their status in those homes? You had widespread, you have several cases of honor killings, right? Where men killed women of their own family rather than let them fall into the hands of the enemy, right? Women also committed mass, they took their own life, a kind of honor suicide, if you will, jumping into wells and so on. So violence, partition violence then takes these multiple and complicated forms, which go beyond simply people of one community killing each other, right? There are many kinds of violence, and women's bodies are the sites on which a lot of this is carried out, right? So they suffer on multiple counts. And the work of, as I mentioned, Urvashi Butalia, Ritu Menon, and Kamla Bhasin, etc., very central to recovering some of this. From Pakistan, there is scholar Farooq Khan, who also does oral histories, interviewing women in particular. So, which brings me to the question of oral history. History has tended to be official grand narratives based on written records, right? But with partition studies, a very important archive of oral, history writing has been transcription of oral histories has been started, and there are many efforts. There is the 1947 Partition Archive Project, which systematically records this. Because some of it is because, let's say women didn't have access to literacy. How would you get their stories, right? They will not write about it. And some of these stories are so traumatizing that people have also forgotten about them deliberately as an effort to continue with living. So there are very complex issues of remembering, the ethics of remembering, the ethics of transcribing it and sharing it in public that we have to also engage with when we think about, how we reconstruct partition histories. Because there was so much shame, there was so much trauma that people, have suppressed those stories, in order to carry on with their lives. Someone like Ashish Nandi has been engaged for several years now on a long project. He, from the point of view of social psychology, of political psychology, trained in multiple disciplines, studying the partition through interviews, right, of various kinds, of all kinds of people, survivors, perpetrators, administrators, and so on. So that's one kind of work that is ongoing, which tries to, understand the very complex nature of these narratives. So we need to go beyond the literate classes. We need to go beyond the comfortable middle classes. How do you get the voices of the really marginalized in all of this, right? That's one problem of historiography, of writing history, that you have to engage with when you're working with. And as I mentioned, the question of caste has been neglected, like it has often been neglected in other dimensions. And that's a big gap that is, waiting to be filled. So I think I shall take a break here from talking. I see that I've been talking for over an hour now. This may be a good place to stop and have a conversation. I would like to hear from people if they would like to add anything.
I'm going to start because this is, by the way, I work for India-Pakistan peace. So this is like a topic which is like really close to my heart. So since the time Behzad told me, I was actually looking forward to it. And in fact, I have read a lot of this literature or heard about it. And there are, especially in Punjab, like you said, Punjab is a little more documented. There are actually cultural centers which work towards, some kind of understanding between the East and West Punjab. And they especially use a lot of literature to make that sort of bond. And that, and of course the partition archives and the oral histories. In fact, I was present when Kuldeep Nayarji's oral history was being recorded. So, but I'll still mention this, that a lot of, like, especially the women part, I've heard a lot of this, but there were so many layers that even I have not heard in your talk. So I just wanted to thank you to just like enlightening me to a lot of that. There's one story which was in a form of a letter in the Amritsar Partition Museum that sort of stayed with me. Was again a woman's story. there was a woman who was in love with some man, and she was on the Pakistan side of the undivided India, and there was some kind of a class or caste difference, and her family was completely against their marriage. So she was betrothed. She was engaged to some other man of equal caste or class. I don't remember the exact dynamics, but there was some kind of a difference. And then the partition happens, and while transferring, her entire family dies, and she faces a lot, she's raped, and she's completely in her words, ruined. And when she comes to this to the Indian part of Punjab, and she and her fiance's family, and the fiance completely disowns her, and they say that we can't, and she's hungry, and she's torn clothes, etc., and she's in that kind of a horrible state, and she refugee camp where her erstwhile lover is actually volunteering, and they get married. And I mean, the way she's written it, I think that entire I mean, of all the things that I saw, somehow, that story stayed with me. And the way she's written it is that there's so much that the dark part actually sort of gave way to the happier part of her life, and how she came to terms with it. So I'm getting a little emotional. I'll let somebody else take over, but I just wanted to share that one story that sort of stayed with me.
Yeah, thank you, Pragya. Yeah, the stories are amazing, and you cannot generalize. There are there's a lot of pain and suffering and violence and madness, but there's also enormous humanity. The fact that so many people survived and managed to cross over was possible only because people of the other community helped them. Ashish Nandi talks about it, that at least 40% of the people they interviewed, he says, acknowledged receiving help from members of the other community. So there is also hope in this, right? In the worst of times, people did show up for each other, right? Yeah. Anyone else who would like to? I know that partition is not, I know there is someone from Tamil Nadu. I was looking at where people were from, and I know that partition does not resonate that much in all parts of India, especially in the south. I had spoken about it in Bangalore, and I was told that, don't. But it's, partition is also a metaphor for divisions, the divisions between human beings, and you can apply it to any context. And the world is clearly full of conflict and violence based on identities and, rigid identities. And if you look at it ecologically, then the man or the human, non-human disconnect, human disconnect from nature is also a kind of partition, right? And you can think of the tale of a Tulsi plant also as a shedding light on that. That here's, this connection with the plant world, which very, very profound connection with the plant world, which can, and we say that in all the poetry, in the Bengali poetry, especially which I read out earlier, Jibanananda Das, and the very strong sense of emotional bond with the land, with the trees, the flora and the fauna, which is a major part of the crisis that's currently facing us globally as as a species. So you don't have to think of partition only in terms of that particular moment. There are lessons here for studying any conflict situation and for studying any kind of division and any kind of partition.
There've been, I think, one of the recent things that have been are being documented is, after the independence of Bangladesh, how there's some families who migrated twice for India. So that's one of the things. And I also wanted to bring in, again, this is not the 1947 partition, but more like 1971, where a Pakistani poet, I think Nasir Turabi, he wrote that very famous song which comes in the serial Wo Hum Safar Tha. So he actually wrote it as a note to Bangladesh as a separation from Pakistan, and that wo hum safar tha, but and something like wo bewafa nahi tha, that kind of thing. Hum nawai na thi. So it is another personification of the nation state in a way.
Yeah. Faiz also wrote actually a very powerful poem when he went to Bangladesh. He did write a poem, but we don't need to go there for too much.
Yeah. So Jay and Solomon have raised their hands. Jay, you can go, and then Solomon. Thank you.
Ma'am, this was a really enlightening talk because I mean, I'm a student of history. So when we studied partition, it's a very, the angle is political, as it's a very political angle that we study, partition from. So it creates a disconnect. So I don't particularly have a question. I just have a few comments, and maybe a question comes up because uh, you know, uh, I listened to your talk, and a lot of literature. I like my perspective here is on partition is basically deals with a lot of loss. Essentially, like even your talk also began with emphasizing how most of these writers, these authors came up with a yearning for their land that they are separated from. So I was curious that given in the context of the like extreme amounts of violence that was committed during partition, I mean it is one of the greatest tragedies of the 21st century. But are there any sort of themes of reconciliation that come up, and when do they come up in when we talk about literature in part, because it wasn't basically one community committing violence against another. It was a very mutual sort of, essentially all sides have done their fair share of atrocities, and now when it comes to reconciliation, how does literature approach that?
Yeah, so some stories do point that out. I think I mentioned Anirudh Kala's collection, on contemporary writing, in which the first story itself is about reconciliation. It's about the son of somebody who was killed by a Sikh, on that side, coming to India, tracking down the killer, and then it's a very beautiful meeting between them. Right? There is no anger, and it's a kind of healing moment. So the next generation, in a sense, is not in the mode of revenge, but there's a very different. And this man also, the man who killed his father, also breaks down. This strong masculine figure who would never be seen crying, starts weeping. So tears, are one of the ways in which this humanizing happens, this reconciliation happens. So there are, those kinds of incidences that you will find scattered. In Fikrat Oswi, there are, that's actually not literature. That's his memoir. So he talks about, a building being burned down. And let me just read that out. The date is 11th August, 1947. It was a curious mass with Hindus and Muslims. Both were trying to douse the fire together. The fire had united two cultures and two religions. I welcome such a fire. I salute it. I'm ready to sacrifice millions of philosophical, learned, and literary opinions and views on such a fire that allowed Muslims and Hindus a common torment on 11th August. Right? So there was, and he himself describes an absolutely stunning example of forgiveness and reconciliation and this is a memoir, so this is not fiction. One of his friends, Ali Muhammad, his childhood friend and companion, they used to play gilli danda together in the colony, big landlord in the settlement, kills Fikrat Oswi's child. And then says, I don't know what came over me. He says, a harsh and rapid gust of wind came and she broke with a snap to fall into my yard, as if some force of nature killed that child. And then he says, he gives his son to Fikrat Oswi. He says, now you take my son and do that to him. Right? He says, fling him, brother Fikra, dash him hard on the ground, such that my sins may be forgiven. Right? Now, of course, what does Fikr Safi say? He says, I hugged the little rose-like Rashid to my heart. That's the boy. Go away, Ali Muhammad, you have gone mad, he says to his friend. Why don't you go get yourself treated? Go, I will not give Rashid to you. Rashid is my son now. Right? So here, and this is real life.
Yeah, so he rejects this eye for an eye and,
completely, yeah. It's a
endless compassion.
Absolutely. So it's, and he's recognizing that Ali Muhammad, his best friend from childhood, has done something which is not typical of him, and he's not done it in his right mind. So, and it takes a largeness of heart, I suppose, to be able to rise above it. So, and there are, he has to bring his wife from the village, and he sends his Muslim friends, and he says, people told me, why are you sending Muslims to bring your wife? The times are bad. And he says, no, they're my friends. So he in his own life refuses till the very end, until they're compelled to leave, to buy into the logic of the partition. He's resisting. So there are stories of resistance of this kind.
Ma'am, one other thing I want to ask is basically, like, when literature is discussed in the context of partition, how the approach to literature has evolved over generations. So could you please explain that to me, where basically the generation immediately that experienced partition and how their kids, grandkids, and now us, essentially, contemporary authors have perceived partition and how literature on that has evolved?
Yeah. So it's, there is the benefit of hindsight,
Yeah.
So people like Manto, people like Fikr Toswi, people like Amrita Pritam are responding to the pain of the partition in the here and now, right? But subsequent writers have also gone back, to the previous generation, and I think there's a little bit more reflection. There isn't that sense of that anguish in the same way, because it's very raw. In Fikr Toswi, it's very raw. Amrita Pritam is very emotional and raw, right? Because you are in the middle of it. So later writing, can take these kinds of positions. It can also show you what happens to the next generation. As I mentioned, there is this case of this man who goes and meets the killer of his father and forgives him, right? So there is literally the benefit of, time having passed, right? Or you can have someone like Gulzar saying, Abhi aur hai partition. It's not over yet. Right? Because every time there is a flare up of any kind of tension, then you're reminded that it's not over yet. So it can take many forms. It depends on what you're responding to at what point in time.
Ma'am, basically, in contemporary, literature regarding, partition, I have observed that a lot of it is now fictionalized. Essentially, more fiction. I'm not claiming to be an authority, but it's my perspective. So maybe there is more non-fiction as well, but not in the context of history, but in terms of individual stories, a lot more fiction is being adopted when stories of partition are being told in contemporary, basically literature, rather than the very real, immediate that we discuss.
See, that's obvious. That's for obvious reasons, because the generation that experienced it is, so they are recording their memories in these archive projects. So there you have, history writing, and, there's a museum in Amritsar, there's a museum in Delhi. So all these are, trying to capture the real material history, the artifacts, etc. So that's there, that's going on. Literature is by nature, it's fiction is the primary form of it. So I don't think there is a neglect of history. Oral history projects are very active currently.
Yes. My grandparents were basically interviewed by my classmate for this oral history project as well. So yeah.
So you won't have people writing about it in the here and now, because it's not happening here and now for obvious reasons. So it would have to be memory.
And just one final thing, I want your perspective on this. That, like, do you feel that fiction is a easier way to connect with, the memories of partition than, reading real accounts for some people, or like in general. I'm not claiming to be making the assumption that one thing is better than the other. I just wanted your perspective on unaccessibility, essentially, where people may, connect with the real events of partition, but through a more fictionalized lens, so that it makes it easier for them to relate.
How do you respond to that question? You've read both.
Yeah, but it's like, in my personal opinion, because how I interact with history, it's a mixture of essentially, both, where I prefer, and I read history, but it's a very academic sort of reading, so it's not a human connection I'm looking for in that case, right? It's a very academic thing. It's a footnotes and all that thing, citations. But fiction, I feel, is a very good conduit to interact with human emotion, or in that sense.
Yeah. Also, you're absolutely right that fiction makes it come alive in a real way. It fleshes out the real human cost of the partition, right? You don't see it as statistics or something out there, right? You see it as, as a human reality, which is what it is, right? So it acknowledges the pain, and it also acknowledges the complexity and layers of any situation, in a way that historians have often failed to do, because they tend to, they do a grand narrative, or, of course, subaltern historiography has tried to look at fiction also, right? It's looking at non-official sources and oral histories and so on. So history writing is also now using literature in constructive and creative ways to understand how reality must be understood. The traditional history writing of the old days, has tended to be the meta-narrative, the grand narratives of history, which tend to neglect margins, which tend to neglect sometimes, the actual experiences of people. And that's not very helpful in the long run if you're trying to, what I think it has to also do with, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to make people reflect on human brutality and, the need to maybe intervene in this? Right? Can you appeal to people's emotions and move them in ways that, political discourse or historical narration will not? I think so. People don't get moved by historical commentary as much. So yeah, literature, just hits you.
Yeah.
It hits you. It hits the spot. It moves you. I mean, Amrita Preetham's poem, Aakha Waris Shah Nu, was recited at the Mazar of Waris Shah in Pakistan. So it becomes part of it. It's as if, so Waris Shah is sung, right? So it's as if this written poem is returned to the oral form, and it becomes part of a lived tradition again. And it literally becomes a part of a kind of reconciliation, because here's an Indian writer whose poem is being sung in Pakistan. So and I mean, we all know that music and literature and poetry moves us. I hope it does.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
It can change people more than intellectual arguments can. So, I mean, we all know that. I mean, look at the popularity of Coke Studio in India and of Lata Mangeshkar in Pakistan, and Mohammad Rafi. People are moved by the arts.
There's also one more aspect of literature that I just wanted to bring in, and it was recent. So there's this recently a play was in one of the theaters in Delhi. It was called Jine, that saying Jine Lahore ne dekhya wo Jamyani. So, and it's a story of, I don't know how many of you know this, but there's this, so the play talks about this Muslim family which migrates to Pakistan and goes to, they allotted a Haveli, which was earlier, which earlier belonged to some Hindus. And they actually were surprised to find an old, really old woman, Hindu woman living there. And she just refuses to go out. And then, it's their entire, so initially they try and kick her out, but then eventually they want to live with her. And then, how the community around them responds, and etc. etc. And when she dies, they cremate her. And actually, Maulvi suggests that you should cremate her, but then some of the unruly people they kill that Maulvi for suggesting something like this. So how she becomes like a family, and she never moves back. So I'm just saying that even like plays are being made on the part on yeah.
I don't know if you've heard of Gitanjali Shri's novel Tomb of Sand, which won the Booker, the International Booker, 2 years ago. It's a very large novel, originally written in Hindi as Ret Samadhi. That is also partly a partition novel because it's about an 80-year-old woman who, after she becomes a widow, goes back to Pakistan and rediscovers Lahore and kind of sort of travels without permission. And it's a very and people like characters out of partition literature like Toba Tek Singh appear in that. Toba Tek Singh is dancing, in that novel. So that's a very recent novel. So fiction continues to engage with the partition in all sorts of ways, very suggestive ways. So it's by no means a topic from the past.
Solomon, you can ask your question.
Did you want to ask a question, Solomon? You have to unmute yourself.
As you rightly pointed out, that partition ultimately was looked at from the religious point of view, religious identity point of view. Hindus and Muslims moving to each other's land and things like that. In that, two things. I was just wondering, what happened to the indigenous people who were living in the forests of the Bangladesh and moved to India? And is there any literature pointing, written about the indigenous people? We know from the study of indigenous people, actually, in 1855, they moved towards Bangladesh area and remained over there. Then, of course, during 71, once again, they had to come back. But also during the partition also, many of the villages have to shift. They shifted from Bangladesh to this area. So what happens with this sort of a displacement? How did they, go through that? Is there any literature? Of course, you said about the marginalized communities in terms of Dalits.
Yeah,
whereas the tribals, the indigenous communities were living in the forest. They were connected to the land, linked to the land. What happens? The same metaphor, as you rightly pointed out, we can take partition as a metaphor and apply to today the tremendous consequences and the effect of the internal displacement because of the so-called development process, infrastructure building, things like that. I have been visiting some of these colonies, some of these people, and talking to them, how the brutalization has affected in a way. It simply brutalizes the humanness. And a woman pointed out actually to me, yes, we are eating, but we are not human beings. We don't have work to do in the soil. We are not plucking the leaves. We are not making leaf plates. We are not making brooms. We are not sweeping the courtyard. We are not, the grain. We are not cooking what we got from the land. That sort of a humanness, this was one element. I think that displacement within the country today, I think that I don't know how much it is being talked about. It's a sort of a comment that was coming to me. I was just wondering whether was there any spiritual element towards how did they conceptualize the face of God during this brutalization, during this inhumanness, during this madness? Okay, maybe Kali or Durga Ma might have had some sort of a drawing, but did people really sing songs of lamentation, or how did they conceptualize God? Is there something like that? Have you come across in the literature on that? Anything
Oh,
who have commented on the face of God, who have maybe scolded God, who have,
yeah.
God has not stood with us. What sort
Oh,
of
yeah. Oh,
so,
yeah. Yes, yes, yes.
sort of
So
like
absolutely, in Manik Bandhopadhyay, it's made very clear. Mallika says there is, no God. So there is this very angry, rejection of a deity who has abandoned them. So many of it depended also on the writers and where they were coming from. If they would happen to be progressives, they were not inclined towards religion anyway. Manik Bandhopadhyay was not, for instance. There is a sense in which, God seems to have abandoned people. There is that sense of abandonment. Um, and of course, there is also the sense of sometimes there is a use of or evocation of the Sufi tradition as in a tragic mode. So they will remember the Sufi tradition of a particular region. Fikr Toswi will do it, in Chata Darya, in the sixth river. And every time, Baris Shah is also kind of, in a sense, suggesting that Sufi love traditions, love poetic tradition. So there is that sense of how we have, people have forgotten that rich legacy. In Peshawar Express, the Buddha is recalled, Islam is recalled as a religion of peace, So there is this ironic reflection on how the teachings of the great teachers and of the great traditions of religions have been distorted in the hands of killers, basically. How far the behavior of adherents of religion is from the actual teachings of those teachers. So that kind of reflection keeps occurring, um, as you would expect. There are other kinds of writings where, so Intezar Hussain is another writer that you may want to think about, who's written Basti and so on. And he's, again, profoundly influenced by, he evokes people like, Buddha. He talks about the entire, rich shared spiritual heritage of the land, which is, sort of, and he evokes it in a tragic mode. Essentially, it's a question of loss. I think that's primarily it. In some autobiographies, like Himani Banerjee's autobiography, Wandering Through Different Spaces, she actually experiments with Buddhism. She becomes for a short while, she becomes a Buddhist. She is exposed to Buddhism, right? Though she's born into a Hindu family. So there is, and she's critiquing her own family because they are rich zamindars in East Bengal and how they mistreated the peasants in their own. So there are many layers to this. It depends also on the politics of the writer. A lot of writers were skeptical about religion to begin with, because they saw it as something that was more open to, or was more often abused than used for the good of human beings. So not God so much, but religion, institutionalized religion and labels, which, in the name of which killing is done. And none of these religions are teaching you to go around killing people. So there is an obvious gap. So that kind of thing comes up again and again.
Of course, it could, during at that time of violence of varied dimension, the communities tries to guard and protect its own identity, both at a personal level and a communitarian level, and therefore the fundamentalistic dimension of the religion will be emphasized in terms of rituals, following rituals, various songs. It will be emphasized. But I think it is, and perhaps people will be moving towards that. Maybe they will be expressing it without even, believing or getting convinced. But at a personal level, it is what would be the type of religion, what would be the type of religiosity, the spirituality that really gives them a tremendous amount of strength, a spiritual dynamism to go through, to cope up with the violence, and how they look at it.
Yeah, I think there are different
I think
forms.
that perhaps the depth level they would have definitely gone through. I think many of these writings and the poems and the memoirs also you'll have to look at it from that point of view.
If I see Svikrit Osvi and
maybe explicitly they may not have mentioned it.
No, what I'm trying to say is that, acting, when Fikrat Osvi refuses to behave with the logic of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
Exactly.
He is not speaking from a position of religion. He's a atheist, he says.
Yeah.
You could be profoundly human and humane without being a believer.
Yeah.
A lot of positions are also there. Those positions are also to be considered, I feel.
Also sense of a protest that you pointed out. Many of them, they don't want to move.
Protest also against religion, because religion is dividing.
Religion.
Yeah. So there are different perspectives, I would say, but to be deeply humane, I don't think you have to necessarily be a believer.
Be spiritual, it's okay.
I mean, you can be spiritual without being a theist.
Yeah.
Or belonging to an, I think that's one thing that comes out repeatedly in the writings of people like Mantu and all, who are highly skeptical about religion. That the really good people, the people who act with ethical conviction, are very often acting outside of the space of religion and of, so-called, piety. And the pious people are often hypocrites. So that's one of the things that keeps coming up. People who evoke God are often the ones who are the villains, because they're misusing the name of God. Even Pramatha does it in The Final Solution, that really villainous guy who's, he says, oh, whatever God wills, because that's often used as an argument by villains, right? To say it's all God's will, right? When you've created the conditions and you blame it all on God.
Yeah.
So the misuse of religion is, I think, more of a recurrent theme, as you would expect, because
definitely, yeah. Thank you, madam.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, I'll just share something because Solomon spoke. One of the things that one of the non-fiction books that was there is Alice Albania's story, The Story of a River, and it traces the Indus from the mouth to the source. And one of the things that is spoken about it is not a partition book, but it basically just talks about how civilizations around a river changed. And one of the things that comes up for me is that earlier, the cleaning, the sewage work, and the that work was done by the Dalits the Hindu Dalits. And once they moved to India, the entire that job came on the shoulders of Christians, because the Muslims, if they especially the elite Muslims, if they put their hands, if they dirty themselves, then they cannot pray, and they have to pray 5 times a day. So how many times you can have a bath? So that was one of the conundrums, and how that shifted. So that is just because, it just came to my mind because Solomon, he works a lot, with interfaith, etc. And also and especially the downtrodden in Jharkhand, like Dalits, etc., and Adivasis. So it just somehow came into my mind because he spoke up. Ranveer, please ask your question.
Yeah. Hi. It was a very wonderful experience just listening to you. I stay in Jammu. I teach here in a central university, and we just within the proximity of border, we are just having just various connection to the border, stories related to the borders, even the kind of vulnerability which our students sometimes experience. I would like to share just one interesting episode, uh, not with the partition, but the kind of vulnerability border also pose. So one fine day, which was scheduled as one of our fieldwork day, I teach in the Department of Social Work. So it was a routine fieldwork exercise, and I was calling my supervisors. Okay, what's the plan of the day? Where you will be going and all? And there was background noise coming for some lot of firecrackers kind of stuff. And student was saying, "Sir, today's border shelling is happening, and we will not be able to just move out from our house." And I, being from Himachal, known for very peaceful place, stayed in Delhi for very long period and then just never experienced this thing. So we were very surprised that what to say, what not to say, and just we said, okay, just take care of yourself. And just the very next week, we visited the place just to see and just to feel that how the situation is. So it is just so different kind of experience. So the border which is in Rajasthan, the border which is in UP next to Nepal, the border which is in Arunachal next to China, it is completely different as compared to border which is just here in J&K, and particularly in Jammu. So we have, this is known as an international border, but this in itself is just volatile in nature. So sometimes cross border firing is happening. So the moment you go near to the border, the presence of military and various kind of barbed wires and many barricades, checkings, watchtowers, and then bunkers, slowly bunkers for people in case of cross-border shelling. And because most of the people in those areas, they are from some defense services, so almost in every household people have their own safe houses in case of uh, cross border firing happen, shelling happen. So this was a very different kind of experiment, this experience we had. So we just wrote a small piece on that part also. Um in continuation to to Solomon, about religion and its how what kind of role it played during this whole literature in the partition. One thought which came to my head is that I consider that this is grief, vulnerability, and this victimhood. It created some kind of solidarity during the literature which exists in the during the partition. So whether it's the love of their land, passion for their land, and just loss of something, and lot of different identities were either submerged or consolidified during this solidarity. And this is such a weird understanding that during festivity, any kind of festivity, if we look around, then various inclusion and exclusion happen on basis of the similar kind of social identities, whom to invite, whom not to invite, right? So with whom to just carry along with whom we have to just exclude in various functions, social gatherings and all. But during that tough times, just all those identities that get submerged, completely submerged. So just a not a question is say just a normal different kind of thought.
Yeah. No, that is indeed true. I mean, emergencies can bring out new kinds of, priorities and create different solidarities. Yeah. But what is also interesting is that people continue, the internal diversity in many of these, societies that are, whether it's the asylum or whether it's that house in Bangladesh that these people go to in the tail of a tulsi plant, there's also an absence of solidarity that we see there because they don't allow other refugees to come in. So sometimes crises can also bring out the most selfish instincts. So literature also shows you that that these people who are themselves seeking shelter and have just taken over somebody's house, now think that they own it, and they are not allowing other equally vulnerable poor refugees of their own religion, to take shelter. So sometimes this literature shows you, a very cynical view of human nature. So this theme keeps coming up, the dehumanization of people. But you also have remarkable acts of, extraordinary compassion and generosity that are also highlighted.
One thing I would like to share is this book. It's with me since long. So yeah, but now you mentioned, now I'll start reading it. One of my student, he gifted it to me, but now definitely I have to read it.
It's a very, can you read Hindi? Do you read
Yes,
Hindi?
yes, very,
Then
very
I
nicely.
would suggest read the original, please.
Oh, definitely, I will do that. And nowadays, I also just started getting interested into Dogri literature. They also use Devanagari script basically. So I'm reading some stories in Devanagari, and particularly the old literature and all. That's also just coming up very nicely.
Mm-hmm. No, literature is a wonderful window to society, to politics, into everything, actually, psychology. So writers see things and are able to probe areas which sociologists and historians and political scientists may not enter, because there doesn't seem to be enough data or enough, like you
I,
need to work with larger units.
you might correct me if I'm wrong. So I don't have much expertise in literature per se, but sometime we discuss that what is the major distinction between sciences and social sciences, particularly in regard to publication and all. So sometimes we say that okay, in sciences, most of the publications which happen, they are reporting various incidences which are happening in a very controlled environment, their labs and all. In social sciences, we are engaging with ideas at various levels and just contesting the ideas, just engaging with ideas, and we are just creating our own opponent and then fighting with that. Literature is, it is just, we are reading, we are engaging with the idea, but going with the flow. We are not contesting anything, we are just going with the flow. Is it a right way to put it, or
I don't know if you mean by literature the practice of writing literature or critically analyzing.
engaging with it just while just reading it?
No. Reading is,
One,
of course, reading is a complex process. I don't think the way literature has changed, or the study of literature has changed in the last few decades. It has actually drawn a lot from the social sciences. So we do, feminist analysis, Marxist analysis, psychoanalytical reading, etc., cultural studies. In fact, there is a reaction against that now, and people are saying, no, let literature be literature, read for pleasure also. Because if it's too much of this, it seemed to be a class in, sociology or political science or history, rather than, studying literature as something which has something specifically literary about it. So, no, it's become very analytical, and it's engaging with a lot of theories drawn from.
so is this analytical frame, is it just a adoption that we social scientists, we always just look for sciences, whatever they are doing with social sciences, try to replicate that thing. First management try to replicate that thing, then social sciences, and now literature is trying to replicate the same thing which social sciences used to do.
Literature has come full circle. Ye ho chuka hai. This happened. So this happened in the academy in the West. With the influx of theory. From
Yes.
70s onwards, and it sort of came to us also eventually. So because we do copy, but it's not like people were not doing something similar here independently. There were traditions of Marxism, certainly, which were doing it. They didn't necessarily borrow from the American Academy. There was. But yeah, the older way of studying literature back in our grandparents' times or my parents' generation was appreciating it or, praising it or, just sort of remembering, great lines and memorizing great lines. That approach was thrown out in the academy a while back. But we're coming back to the idea of the pleasures of the text and of the way in which it affects you emotionally and, and so on. So that the affective aspect of literature, and the pleasure aspect of it has been revived in the recent past because people felt that it had become too mechanical. Literary studies was, beginning to sound like, sociology with a literary twist, political science with a literary twist, But there is another way of engaging with literature, which is not in the academy, but how people read it, as readers, right? So when you say that Amrita Pritam's poem is recited at the Mazar of Waris Shah, that is not filtered through literature departments. That is a direct experience of that poetry by people who are not necessarily trained to appreciate poetry academically. So that power is there, no? Satire, people who wrote. So literature also has a living existence in society. It can, plays are performed, nukkad natak hota hai. That is a direct way of reaching people, reaching with a message or reaching for pleasure, but which circumvents the academic discourse. Literature exists in society as a real thing also. People read for pleasure. People don't always read, not everybody is a professor of literature or publishing in a journal. But literature is still surviving, and thriving, in fact. So that's a different kind of space. That is a space of, where your whole being is being, where you're also delighting in language, by the way. One reason I want you to read Tomb of Sand in the Hindi, Great Samadhi, is because the Hindi is itself part of the fun. I wrote a very long review of this for the book review.
Oh. No, I think the original text always have this the more beauty. For example, if all of us we read Foucault in English translation, and I think just due to the translation, it became very dry. So that
yeah. I mean, we often, and especially if the writer is doing very experimental and playful things with the language, as she is, then the entire joy is gone. So English flattens out a lot of this.
Exactly.
If you can read the original, I would request you to please read the original.
I will be reading it. I will definitely be reading it. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to talk to you. Thank you.
Dr. Joshi, since you brought out languages, I was just curious, are there any, literature, notable literature that you'd like to share about Sindhi language, or also any literature written by Muhajirs,
Yeah. So Sindhi, I wasn't, I'm not very well versed in. We've recently started reading Sindhi literature in our literature paper, So we've just started a story. There's one story called The Document, Dastavez, which we have included in our syllabus. That is a Sindhi story because Sindh had a very interesting composite culture again, right? And Dastavez is a brilliant, very moving study of how, Dastavez is like, what does it mean? The document, right? It's an official document and bureaucratic, piece of paper. And opposed to that is the emotional connection between people across communities. So that juxtaposition is very strongly brought out. There is a lot of work done on Sindhi literature, being done currently on Sindhi literature. And let me see, I'm not able to immediately recall, any names. This is not something that I have personally engaged with in great, literature, any great detail. But there recently it has been made available in Professor Rita Kothari has, for instance, written extensively about it and has also translated a lot of Sindhi literature. So you can look up Rita Kothari. She teaches at Ashoka University.
Okay.
So she's one of the people you might want to, look up when you want to look at current critics and literary figures, translators working with Sindh and Partition.
Yeah, there was just the Sindhi part came to my mind also because we had a group of Pakistani students long back, 2018. I'm talking about where these things would happen. They were on an exchange program to India for a small trip, and there was a Sindhi girl, and she told me that she's like, we. So there
were
would be.
They from LUMS by any chance?
No, they were from NCA and from Sindh University. These people, so there were a group of people from Lahore and a group of people from Sindh. So the Sindhi students started saying that, hey, let's talk in Sindhi so that the Lahoris don't understand us. And there was this Indian Sindhi family sitting there, and they just replied in Sindhi that, oh, we understand. So and that's how that entire this girl told me about like how rich that conversation became from just being like this little, just to irritate the Lahoris, we want to speak in Hindi to in Sindhi, not Hindi, and that again, this is not literature, this is a real story that somebody from one of the students again from this batch told me, she said that her dadi was Hindu, and in a Muslim family. I don't know how that happened, but then she was Hindu, and she would keep the Lakshmi Ganesh, like we keep them in the kitchen, because kitchen is where prosperity is. And none of the family members were allowed to go into the kitchen with slippers on or shoes on. And she said, my dadi has expired like years ago, but in my home, in my chacha's home and my bua's home, instead of the idols, the Quran Sharif is kept in the kitchen, and still we are not allowed to go into the kitchen with slippers on. So how maybe the religion might sort of change, but the association or the culture that comes with living with a living identity tends to remain the same. So
yeah, there are fascinating ways in which these things overlap. I mean, we could talk forever.
Yes.
Maybe 9 p.m. I realize.
Yes. So since there are no more questions, Dr. Joshi, I really want to thank you. And this is also a personal thanks, because I'm so fascinated in the subject. And I hope I can pick your brains again sometime in person and in the office, or this has been an absolutely amazing, enlightening session. I think everyone, I can see it from their faces, they've enjoyed it quite a bit, and it's been there are a lot of aspects that literature can throw, and I think they will keep in mind the next time they actually sit down on a dialogue table, that to also look at the writings that have been done on a particular subject. So I think thank you for throwing light on that part, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for inviting me and for giving me this very diverse audience, because that challenged me in different ways. I had to think about how best to communicate this. I'll take back some of the ideas, and let's keep up the good work. Nice meeting everybody. Bye. And Solomon, that point was brilliant about the Adivasis. I would be very interested to find out what happened.
Yeah, I will try to look into it.
Please do.